Paul Pimsleur wanted language learning to be fun, interesting, and engaging, and he spent much of his career finding ways to make language learning keep the attention of language learners without them needing to refer to a dictionary. Now, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing is a different topic, but to do this, Pimsleur focused specifically on specific words and phrases, and he focused on them extensively with a form of spaced repetition. And that's what his various programs involve. And the spaced repetition elements within his program typically involved very short learning sessions. Now, we talk about shrinking attention spans now as if it's something new, but Paul Pimsleur was addressing this back in 1972. In fact, before his recorded programs with which most people are familiar, he had language learning books. And in those early books, he suggests that students of his own era couldn't focus on a paragraph with more than 200 to 300 words in it at a time. Very little has changed, it seems, and many people still seek out and try the Pimsleur approach. But what is it exactly, and how can you know in advance if the Pimsleur language program for any of the languages they have available are going to work for you? Well, the good news is I'm going to do a Pimsleur review. I'm going to share my experiences with Pimsleur, both the early books and the recorded programs, as a learning and memory expert here on the internet. I'm going to tell you why parts of his approach work and how to enhance those parts using the Memory Palace technique. And that way, if you're going in cold, you can hit the ground running. And if you already have a bunch of Pimsleur books or audio recordings kicking around, you're going to be able to get more out of them. So if you're ready, this is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmemorymethod.com. Hit that thumbs up. If you're on a thumbs up platform, get subscribed if you're not already subscribing wherever you're watching or listening to this. And one of the things that I really love about Pimsleur is he accomplished a few things at the same time. So he was able to introduce you to new vocabulary and phrases by using listening in a particular way that lended itself to practicing comprehension. He also gave you the opportunity for voluntary speaking practice and exposure to what is called scientifically passive and irregular spaced repetition. Now, this is a relatively weak invitation to do those things because you have to, of your own volition, do them. You don't have a speaking partner with you that's prompting you, literally drawing out of you a response. Also, there's a sense of active recall in the Pimsleur program that is also relatively weak, but it's still there. Now, those are scientific terms, active recall and spaced repetition and so forth. If you haven't seen my videos on those topics, please feel free to check them out or listen to the podcast episodes. Now, having read a few of Dr. Pimsleur's textbooks and gone through his programs for a couple of languages, I really do feel he was a credible educational innovator. And there's all kinds of criticisms of all these things, usually from people who, as I hear they say in Spanish, otra cosa es con guitarra, which apparently means it's easy to laugh at the guy with the guitar in his hands, right? And there's real genius in what he put together, even if it has a bunch of weaknesses. What doesn't? I mean, we all have our memory biases. We can't see everything. But as a language learning tool, I think it's got more strengths than weaknesses. But what are those weaknesses? Well, in addition to not having an actual human draw responses out of you for the speaking part, you have user error, right? So these are common to all self-study programs. The individual has to bring their own personal volition. They have to have some level of mental strength to get through the lessons, no matter how short they are, no matter how few words they have in them. So whether you're using one of the Pimsleur textbooks, like the ones he made for Spanish and French are really interesting, or you're using an audio program, the first thing you want to consider is, are you mentally stimulated by reading books on your own or listening to audio programs in a quiet study place where you won't be disturbed? These are know thyself questions, and they're really important considerations because that's essentially what the Pimsleur approach is. It's a technique that involves you studying from a book or an audio program on your own. You listen by yourself, you repeat words and phrases based on a kind of mix of spaced repetition and what we sometimes call in memory science context-dependent memory exercise. Now, what does context dependence mean? Well, you're often asked to imagine that you're in an airport, for example.
Imagine an American man sitting next to a German woman. He wants to begin a conversation, so he says, "Excuse me."
And that mental image, even though I think Pimsleur could do a lot more to make that more like a memory palace, that image itself gives you context and it can have a memory advantage. So you can get quite good at playing the game of listening to the Pimsleur recordings, for example, and responding by repeating what you hear. But you won't necessarily be able to read or speak the language in a real life situation because just parroting those phrases is not speaking a language. It is literally using those phrases, and the answer you get back may not be the answer that you ever heard in the recording. So I would suggest that we are all learners who need interaction with others, but some people can get a lot out of them. And if you are more in the area of needing interaction, Pimsleur recordings and books can be incredibly boring, right? So what you need to really think about is you. And don't judge the product for what it is based on your particular extroversion or introversion, as the case may be. This approach is definitely legitimate in just about every way. It's just not something that's going to help you develop fluency for reasons we'll discuss in a minute. But let's get more into the specifics of how it helps with language learning. The answer is that Pimsleur Method doesn't help you learn a language at all, and it can't. It's weak in so many cases because it's almost purely auditory. Now, if you have a strong imagination and you can imagine those airport situations, or restaurant situations that are in some of the recordings, you can start to use those as imaginary memory palaces. But even if you go through the guidebook, for some of the languages, it's not going to help you in Japanese, for example, learn the hiragana and katakana or kanji. For Mandarin, it's quite weak in terms of how the hansa works and all this sort of stuff. And again, you don't really have actual answers that people are going to give you. So in the Mandarin thing, if I remember correctly, it starts with ni hui shuo chongwen ma, or actually it's ni hui shuo putonghua ma, right? And are people actually using putonghua as opposed to chongwen to describe Chinese? It's got all these kinds of problems. So you want to supercharge it with mnemonics. I'll never forget remembering ni hui shuo putonghua ma. Is that right, April? That's right, she says. I don't know if her voice got Di shua de dui. So I remember sitting there and memorizing that, and I remember I had Bruce Lee with his knee hitting Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, the author, and Hemingway's throwing a shoe back at him. Ni hui shua. So the knee in Bruce Lee's knee. Hemingway, hui, H-way, Hemingway, shua. And I just made an actual memory palace. I could have used the airport, I believe it was, in the Pimsleur dialogue, and that would be a weak memory palace, but nonetheless, I used a real memory palace. Now, in that case, I used the Stabi in Berlin, and one of the reasons why I used that is because I remember reading about Bruce Lee in that library, and this is basically how the magnetic memory method works, is you always just think, what's going to be the best memory palace for this? And you use some kind of alphabetical association. So in order to remember ni, which is you, or ni, I think it's got the third tone in it, you want to, is that right?
That's right.
Right again, ni shua de dui, or wo shua de dui. The basic idea is you do that sort of linking. So, but I could have used an imaginary memory palace based on the airport. Now, the thing is don't give up hope. You can develop the ability to memorize all of any dialogue in Pimsleur and then take it into a more rigorous language learning setting that involves reading, speaking, writing, listening, and memorizing. So, it really helped me in Mandarin a great deal to be able to do that, but it didn't make me fluent and it didn't make me learn the language. I had to have native speakers. I went to courses. In some cases, I went to a course before I passed level 3. And by that point, I wasn't listening to Pimsleur at all anymore. But here's what I did when I was, in just to supplement this example that I just gave with Bruce Lee kneeing Hemingway and Hemingway throwing a shoe back at him. While listening, I actively engaged the audio material by writing down a version of what I was hearing. So one of the key weaknesses is that the guidebook has no particular decent pinyin. It has no particular characters, hansa, and I couldn't build flashcards out of any of it because it's just not simply there. And I think this was a great gift because by inventing my own opinion, I took action. I moved forward. Now, has that led to mistakes? Yes, of course. It's not a magic bullet. It's not perfect. But by writing out what I thought I heard, I was able to quickly have mnemonic images come to mind, use memory palaces, and get a decent approximation of what was going on. Then, getting onto Skype at the time, probably use Zoom now, I was able to get into sessions with language learning teachers. They would then help me correct pronunciation and have dialogues with things that a native speaker might actually say. And, it's beautiful. And that's what you want to do. So if you're going to use this, you want to memorize as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and then get into sessions with speakers. So it's a great source of some basic familiarity, some pattern recognition, and it really just gives you an opportunity of your own volition to start answering the questions that come through. The other problem with the Pimsleur program, even though it's still good to go through, I believe, is that the situations are much less relevant in our century than when they were recorded, and they don't seem to have updated them, but I could be wrong about that. People like Benny Lewis and Ollie Richards, they've been doing amazing work by creating books and programs that allow you to have much more contemporary language learning experiences. So I remember Benny having something to do with, being able to ask about Wi-Fi, for example. I don't think you would find that in Pimsleur anyway. And in all these storybooks, they're very, very up to date, dealing with contemporary issues. Even philosophy is something that Ollie has covered in some of his language learning books. Amazing, and not just in one language. So the datedness doesn't devalue Pimsleur that much, but it is something to consider. Now, please make sure you take it to the Big Five of language learning, no matter what language learning source that you're using. So the Big Five of language learning is essential. It's reading, writing, speaking, listening, and using your memory, ideally in optimal ways. I highly recommend that you consider joining me for the Language of Memory Live cohort program at magneticmemorymethod.com/LOM, where you can just say hello and let me know that you're interested in advance notification when the registration period opens. And there's a couple of free videos there that will take you deeper into some mnemonic examples, how to scale your memory palaces so that you can deal with hundreds of words and then thousands of words and balance all of the different resources you have out there on the internet with a intermediate advanced mnemonic strategy with, of course, help for beginners to get to intermediate and advanced. Now, I don't want to discourage you when I use the word intermediate and advanced, because I'll tell you this. If you know where your fridge is, you're already an intermediate memory master, and I will prove it to you in the Language of Memory program. So, magneticmemorymethod.com/LOM for advanced notification and some video tutorials that you can dive into immediately. All right. Now, technically, Pimsleur is not a memorization method. It's not even a memory technique. As Pimsleur wrote, his goal is to help learners increase active vocabulary knowledge and practice grammatical structures through exercises in comprehension. And he would want you to have, through the audio programs, practice in speaking. And I think you should take it to the writing level in the way that I described by just listening to what you hear. Whether it's Mandarin or Spanish, don't worry so much about spelling in the beginning. Just try to figure out what your brain would do in order to have some sort of symbolic interaction with the material, because that's going to help you comprehend what will be the best mnemonic images for you. Then when you're dealing with native speakers and they're helping correct you, you can compound on with those mnemonic images in your memory palaces little images and magnetic associations, if you're not particularly visual, that help you correct the pronunciation. And then, of course, pronunciation is almost a zero-sum game in many situations because there's always endless ways that people pronounce things. I remember learning Ich kaufe in German. I buy, or Ich kaufe bei Lehmann. I shop at Lehmann. And then you'd go into a neighborhood in Berlin, and then all of a sudden you'd hear someone say, Ich kaufe bei Lehmann. Right? Or Ich kaufe, that's what it was. Ich kaufe by Lehmann, right? And I had to logically think, what is it that they're saying there? And they probably mean Ich kaufe, right? So, Hochdeutsch and then whichever slang that was. I never really quite made it out. I heard it in Schoenberg, I believe, but that doesn't mean that that person was speaking Schoenbergerish, because they may have been from a different city altogether, and I lived in Saarland also and learned a little bit of Saarlandish, and it would sometimes confuse me because, they would just say things that are not said in different parts of Germany. Then you try it out in a different part of Germany and people would be like, huh? Keine Ahnung. They have no idea what you're saying. So, the pronunciation thing is highly contextual, and we got to avoid, as adults, getting too lost in, well, why is it this way? Why is it that way? And kind of just roll with the punches and use our memory to correct things. So that's where Pimsleur, is not a memory device at all, because it's going to give you one pronunciation and not really talk about nuances that when you encounter them later, you have to be able to roll with the punches, because you're going to encounter regional variations and not necessarily even understand them or puzzle them out in the way that I did with Ich kaufe versus Ich kaufe. So don't get me wrong. I think that Pimsleur's approach has a lot of effectiveness to it. It's just not a mnemonic strategy. And it's not a mnemonic strategy, first of all, because it's only giving you one way of thinking about things, but it also doesn't involve any elaborative encoding, except for perhaps if you imagine the scenarios and you maybe use those to think through how that could help you remember things. But one thing that I think is really good is the short learning sessions. And that chunks like information together, and we know that chunking is an effective learning strategy. And you want to take it further. Always, you want to take it into your own life, no matter what you do. So here's basically what I suggest that you do. Learn to develop memory palaces, not just any old memory palace, but ideally magnetic memory palaces, which function in particular ways. And, they're becoming more and more attractive to people when they hear about how 3 times world memory champion Alex Mullen uses memory techniques not only for medicine, but also to help him with his own Mandarin, and he's very good with Chinese. You may have heard of students like Sunil Khatri, who's been on my podcast, Kevin Richardson, both of them doing incredibly well with Japanese, thanks to really nailing the memory palace part, because it has huge implications for how that you're able to place full and complete magnetic associations. And wherever you get the material from, if you get it from Pimsleur or whatnot, you want to associate the words that you're learning with familiar locations, not necessarily imaginary airport lounges, right? And then those associations, you want them to be very, very memorable by using images that are already in your mind. So, do you speak Mandarin, right? I created a mental image not based on just abstract things like a knee of some dude that I don't know. It's Bruce Lee's knee, right? And this really is specific because I've spent hours and hours and hours not only watching Bruce Lee, but reading him. Striking Thoughts, great book. And then Hemingway, likewise. I spent hours and hours and hours of my time reading Hemingway. So it's very, very prevalent in my mind, right? And it makes it so much stickier, so much more magnetic. And it can be a little bit difficult in the beginning for you to figure out what those images are going to be for you. But that's what the language of memory live cohort is all about. Making sure you get there faster, because it took me way too long to figure out that that's what magnetic imagery is, and I can help you accelerate that process. The other thing is to read strategically. So if Pimsleur is really lacking, it's that the audio program really could have had more substantial guides like his earlier books that allow you to be able to get the essential reading part of language learning in. Right? If you're only in the presence of a recording, you can do okay, but reading and listening and then having that speaking practice with real native speakers is so key. The other thing is that I do admire Dr. Pimsleur's many innovations, but I feel that one of his motivations was patently false. So many language learning gurus seem to think that students should not be using dictionaries. I find this so strange, because dictionaries are where they store the words. And that's where they store the meanings of the words. Why would you want to avoid them when you're learning a language, right? Not only that, but when you know what a word means in your mother tongue, the dictionary is precisely where you go, right? You want to study your own language using a dictionary. You want to check and validate that things are as you remember them. I'm pretty good in English, but I still go and check what words mean. Not only that, but I love to use Etymonline, which allows me to look at the etymology of words, which helps me improve in my own mother tongue. So this prohibition or deviation from using dictionaries strikes me as utterly false and strange. And there's many ways to get more out of dictionaries, especially when you have a memory palace network linked to the alphabet, and you can just cram in, and I don't mean cram in the studying sense, but really rack and stack all kinds of vocabulary, which you can then scale using a particular approach to the memory palace technique, which I share with you in the free series of videos you get at magneticmemorymethod.com/LOM. There's also pitfalls, though, with too much focus on the dictionary. So there's a lot of words that I know that native speakers don't necessarily know. Abgebaggert is one that I love in German. It's in the German dictionary, but a lot of people, they look at me like, huh? What? You know, and Simperdish, that's another one. I know them, and I can show them to people in the dictionary, but it's not necessarily in use. So in a word, nothing is a magic bullet, but dictionaries do work. And if you, like me, are absolutely fascinated with language, well, then it doesn't matter if the people you're talking to don't know the words necessarily. You can take advantage of it as an opportunity to discuss with them and just have fun with language itself. So does the Pimsleur method really work? Well, as I hope you've discovered in this discussion, I think that it's the wrong question. It's useful as part of learning any language. It's useful as experimentation and exploration of how different educators have innovated and come up with interesting solutions that give you input in a language, but also in this case, some engineering designed to have chunking, a little bit of spaced repetition that helps you form pattern recognition, and it combines a number of approaches in a way that I think is well worth exposing yourself to. And could you skip it? Well, frankly, there are so many sources out there that are pretty much based on what Pimsleur came up with that you're almost going to encounter it anyway. Any recorded program has, at least that I've seen, some influence from the Pimsleur method. And really, I think there's just too many options out there. So if you're going to do something, I would suggest that you use Metivier's razor. Yes, I'm so arrogant and egotistical that I named a rule after myself. I mean, you only live once, right? But Metivier's razor says, if you don't spend 90 days on one thing, you don't get to say that you tried. And it's really, really simple. If you're going to pick a Pimsleur program, stick with it for 90 days. Yes, it has its weaknesses. Yes, there's going to be things that either aren't contemporary or aren't said the way that native speakers would really say it. But you're going to be cross-indexing this during that 90 days anyway, because you are going to go meet with native speakers. You're going to turn the subtitles on wherever you start to really optimize your viewing experience. So you put those subtitles on when you're watching the movie and you get more input, and you pause the video and you take screenshots and you go and you memorize some of those cool words and phrases that you encounter, and you're gonna get more out of it because you are daily exposing yourself to the program that you chose, right? And this is how I've operated and ticked, and it really, really works. So memory palaces are the key to optimizing all of this because they're like these special time-limited containers where no matter where the material is that you're learning from, whether it's subtitles on a movie, whether it's the Pimsleur program, ideally a little bit of both over a long 90-day period, it's going to help you commit essential words and phrases to memory from any source and then use the memory palace the magnetic way to optimize recall rehearsal so that it gets into long-term memory as quickly as possible and stays there, right? And when you follow that 90-day rule, you're much more likely to have another 90 days and another 90 days and another 90 days still, because if you're going to learn a language, fluency, whatever that means, is a long way in the future. I don't think I'll ever become fluent even in English, right? So, do you like the Pimsleur concept yourself? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready to take on the most scientific understanding we have as of today of spaced repetition, go to magneticmemorymethod.com/LOM and then watch my video on spaced repetition next. It's a deep dive study into, after you're done with Pimsleur, taking those things like ni hui shua pu tong hua ma and then using this pattern in order to get that into long-term memory as quickly as possible. Because if you're not using the memory palace that way, it doesn't matter where you're getting the information from. You're not using it as optimally as you could be. And that's what the magnetic memory method is all about. Optimal use, so that you get effectiveness first and then efficiency. And that's what I suggest you dive into next, in addition to joining me, or at least signaling your interest, for Language of Memory Live.